On a crisp December day in 1954, a test pilot named Richard L. Dick Johnson guided a sharp-nosed prototype into the high, thin air above the American desert. The aircraft was the YF-102A Delta Dagger, and as its needle-like frame slid through the sky, its speed crept past a number that had vexed designers and pilots alike. Johnson took the Delta Dagger through Mach 1, beyond the restless, troublesome winds of transonic flight, and into the quiet that follows the boom. It was more than a milestone, it was a proof. The Dagger's tapered body, sculpted according to a fresh idea about how shapes should move through air, showed that an aeroplane could be coaxed from the subsonic world into the supersonic with grace, rather than brute force. That shaping principle, later nicknamed the area rule, would become a lighthouse on the shoals of high-speed design. 17 years drifted by, and in March 1971, another test pilot, Thomas C. Tom McMurtry, lifted a very different sort of aircraft into the sky. This was the F-8 Supercritical Wing Research Vehicle, a flying laboratory that wore a new kind of wing like a tailored coat. Its upper surface looked oddly flat. Its edges seemed understated. Yet the shape promised a near supersonic cruise with less fuel burned, less energy wasted, and more miles unfurled beneath the wings. 17 years after that, in April 1988, a wide-bodied giant heaved itself into the air for the first time. Boeing 747-400, the long-range heir to the original jumbo jet. Sprouting from the tips of its wings were small upturned fins, winglets, that tamed the whirling, wasteful vortices that spill from wingtips and steal fuel. Three very different advances, separated by decades, all nudging aircraft to fly faster, farther, and more economically, and all traced back to the imagination of one quietly relentless engineer. Richard T. Dick Whitcomb, of NACA first and NASA later. If gentle journeys through aerospace history help you unwind, you're warmly invited to subscribe to and like Space Historian. It keeps these calm night flights going without breaking the spell of the story. In the second half of the 20th century, aviation stood in the middle of a peaceful revolution. The jet engine, conceived in Europe and refined in metal and heat, had been joined to wings and fuselages, and the world's distances began to contract. The aeronautical community kept faith with a simple promise: make aeroplanes fly higher, fly faster, roam farther, and do so more affordably. Military needs, national aims, factories, economies, all tugged at that promise, giving it urgency and direction. At the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory in Hampton, Virginia, a place where the wind itself was harnessed and studied, Dick Whitcomb set his mind to that promise. Under the banners of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and later the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, he devised three ideas that would be woven into the everyday fabric of flight: the area-ruled fuselage, the supercritical wing, and the winglet. Each was a way of finding speed or range not by adding power, but by shedding resistance, by smoothing the path through the invisible medium that supports and resists us all. He was independent and visionary, but also practical and precise. And the culture at Langley, which valued both intuition and measurement, gave him room to chase efficiency the way a sailor reads the sea. He was not born with wings, but with curiosity. Richard Travis Whitcomb arrived on the 21st of February 1921 in Evanston, Illinois, and spent his childhood in Worcester, Massachusetts, the eldest of four in a family headed by Kenneth F. Whitcomb, a mathematician-engineer with a tidy mind for numbers and machines. Like so many children of the 1920s and 1930s who looked up when a shadow passed across the sun, young Dick built model aeroplanes, delicate frames of wood and tissue that seemed to hold breath itself. At 12, he gave himself a sanctuary, a makeshift aeronautical laboratory in the family basement. Down there he built and flew. Down there he tweaked and tried again. Down there he found the rhythm that would guide his adult life. He did not yearn to be a pilot. Instead, he chased the pleasure of making something that flew because he had understood the air just enough to persuade it. He made small improvements that revealed a large mind at work. One of his models carried a propeller that, once it stopped spinning, folded back like a bird's tucked wings, reducing drag as the little craft glided. He entered contests and won them. He even won a prize in the Fisher Body Company's model automobile competition, for in those days many of the boys who would become the aeronautical engineers of the 1940s trained their hands and eyes on models and competitions. Even as a teenager, Whitcomb showed that stubborn, hopeful persistence. He would keep at a problem until the problem gave way. A figure in his family loomed large, a paternal grandfather who had stepped away from an Illinois farm to build mechanical vending machines. Independent, driven, and handy with moving parts, the grandfather knew Thomas Edison. Whitcomb listened as a boy to stories about Edison's restless mind and independent streak, and from those stories he built a private shrine. He admired the ideas, yes, but he also admired the way of having ideas. Free, individual, slightly contrary to the expected. Those tales helped shape his own style of engineering. Then came university. Worcester Polytechnic Institute offered Whitcomb a scholarship, and in 1939 he joined its engineering program. He lived at home to save money and spent long hours in the institute's wind tunnel, the place where air could be made visible not with paint or smoke, but with numbers and images and the whisper of a model under load. The war gathered across the oceans, and like many young engineers, he wondered how to help. For his senior project, he designed a guided bomb. He graduated with distinction in mechanical engineering. A feature in Fortune magazine, written in 1943 about the NACA, showed him a path that matched his talents to the nation's needs. He went to Hampton, Virginia, to a government civilian research center, where the wind itself was subject to experiment. By then, the aeroplane had begun to nose into a new and treacherous part of the sky, the Transonic range, where speeds near Mach 1 brought unruly changes. As Whitcomb entered his second year at Worcester, engineers were discovering that at around those speeds, stability and control could shift abruptly. The aeroplane could shudder in an unpleasant buffet, and, most troubling for designers, drag could rise sharply. 3 challenges lay in the way of progress. One was propulsion. Propellers and piston engines, splendidly honed by decades of work, had reached a plateau. They simply could not push an aeroplane cleanly through the Transonic gauntlet. The second and third were of a more scientific flavour. The lack of facilities to test shapes at those speeds, and the lack of aerodynamic concepts to guide the shapes in the first place. The new turbojet, born in Great Britain and Germany in the early 1940s, would address the first challenge by providing the raw thrust. The others would call upon the NACA, and before long, upon Whitcomb himself. Bridging the gulf between subsonic and supersonic would become not just a challenge, but a theme of his work. Little about the transonic regime was well understood then. It sprawls from roughly Mach 0.8 to 1.2, a region where some parts of the airflow around an aeroplane are supersonic while others are not. The main instrument of the aerodynamicist, the wind tunnel, could not be relied upon there because tunnels of the time struggled or simply failed in that regime. Engineers improvised 4 approaches. One was crude and dangerous. Send an aeroplane into a steep dive and record what happened as it neared its terminal speed. The data were brief, the risk real, and because typical aeroplanes of the 1940s had a certain ratio of drag to weight, they could not push past about Mach 0.8 in any case. Another approach was the falling body. Drop an instrumented shape from the bomb bay of a Boeing B-29 and listen as it whistled past. A third was the wing flow model. Bolt a small instrumented aerofoil to the top of a North American P-51 Mustang and let the Mustang's high subsonic flight provide the conditions. The last was to mount small models on rockets and fire them from the shore at Wallops Island on Virginia's eastern shore, capturing a few moments of data as they sped. Each method taught something, but all were short-lived, with complex variables that made it hard to separate the signal from the noise. Even if a tunnel could be tamed to run cleanly in the Transonic, there still was the question of how to shape an aeroplane for it. Europe had been building the foundations of high-speed design since the 1930s. In Zurich, Jakob Ackeret operated the first wind tunnel that could produce flows at Mach 2 and helped other countries build similar instruments. In 1935, the leading minds in high-speed aerodynamics met in Rome at the Volta Conference. There, a German aerodynamicist named Adolf Busemann suggested a radical idea: sweep the wings back from the fuselage to ease the jump in drag near Mach 1. It was a way through the sound barrier that dealt with the air on its own terms, rather than trying to smash through it. In 1944, another German researcher, Dietrich Kuchermann, recognized that a fuselage with a narrowed waist, something like a Coca-Cola bottle, worked well in concert with Busemann's swept wings. Meanwhile, at NACA Langley, an American engineer named Robert T. Jones, working independently, also discovered the virtues of the swept wing. His brief 1945 report gave a clear, elegant account of swept wing aerodynamics, just as American engineers were unpacking a trove of high-speed research taken from Nazi Germany at the end of the war. When those streams of thought merged after the war, many questions remained. NACA undertook 3 major programs in the late 1940s and early 1950s that collectively broke the remaining barriers, both conceptual and practical. John Becker, an engineer who chronicled those efforts, called them one of the most effective team efforts in the annals of aeronautics. The National Aeronautic Association honoured NACA with the Collier Trophy 3 times in that span. The 1947 award recognised the achievement of true supersonic flight by the Bell X-1, a rocket-powered research aeroplane shaped like a .50 caliber bullet, flown by Air Force Captain Charles E. Chuck Yeager, with credit shared by John Stack of NACAA and manufacturer Lawrence D. Bell. The 1951 award went to John Stack and 19 associates at Langley for turning a theoretical notion into a working tool: the slotted Transonic wind tunnel. For the first time, the prize celebrated not a machine that flew, but a tool that helped make all such machines fly better. And the 1954 recognition reflected what that tunnel made possible: a new way to understand and reduce transonic drag, and the designs that would follow from that insight. In the midst of those honours was the shaping of an environment where Whitcomb's way of thinking could pay off. Whitcomb arrived at Langley in 1943 and joined John Stack's Transonic Aerodynamics branch, working in the 8-foot high-speed tunnel. At first, managers placed him in the Flight Instrument Research Division, but he did not stay put. He gravitated toward the puzzles of shape and flow, toward the questions that determined whether a design would cut the air cleanly or be punished by it. Those who worked with him noticed a particular blend of talents: a facility with mathematics, an instinct for how forces would balance, and an aesthetic sense, an eye for the right curve. In 1945, the 8-foot tunnel was upgraded to reach speeds near Mach 0.95, giving Whitcomb daily familiarity with the very regime that had everyone scratching their heads. The challenge was stark. At transonic speeds, shock waves form and drag rises. The Bell X-1, the proof that supersonic flight was possible, was powered by a rocket and designed solely as a research craft. It could blaze through the Transonic, but its shape and method were not those of an operational jet fighter or airliner. Real aeroplanes, heavy with fuel and purpose, would take longer to accelerate and had to make that crossing efficiently. The key, then, was not just to break the sound barrier, but to guide ordinary aircraft through the transonic range between Mach 0.9 and Mach 1.1 without wasting more energy than they could afford. The literature on transonic aerodynamics was thin. Shortly after the war, two British researchers, W.T. Lord of the Royal Aircraft Establishment and G.N. Ward of the University of Manchester, and an American, Wallace D. Hayes, tried to attack the drag problem with mathematics alone. Their equations were elegant, but they did not readily suggest how to sculpt an aeroplane's body and wings. Whitcomb sifted the data NACA had collected, both in ground tests and free-flight trials, and in July 1948 he proposed a series of experiments in the 8-foot tunnel. He wanted to measure how swept wings interacted with fuselages of different shapes, hoping to discover a combination that nudged the transonic drag down rather than up. There had been hints that sweeping the wings could delay the drag rise, and that the fuselage's shape mattered. Perhaps, Whitcomb thought, the right pairing would tame the problem. The models went into the flow from late 1949 into early 1950. The results were discouraging. At Mach 0.95 and Mach 1.2, the combinations produced not less drag, but more even than the sum of each part tested alone. It was as if the wings and fuselage were conspiring against the designer. Whitcomb paused. He needed to step back from combinations and look again at the nature of the air's mischief. That pause coincided with a critical change to the tunnel itself. In the spring of 1948, John Stack had ordered the 8-foot tunnel converted to a slotted throat so that it could operate cleanly in the transonic. The idea was simple in principle. Put slots in the walls of the test section so that air could slip through, relieving the reflections and disturbances that bedevil tunnels near Mach 1. The first conversion did not work well. The flow was patchy, uneven. Whitcomb, working with physicist Ray Wright and engineer Virgil S. Ritchie, took the problem on by eye and hand. They shaped the slots themselves, guided by a feel for how a smooth transonic flow ought to look. They worked with Langley's woodworkers to build a channel downstream that would bring the bypassed air back into the stream gracefully. After months of painstaking fit and test, the 8-foot tunnel began true transonic operations on the 6th of October 1950. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a young engineer helping to refine the very instrument that would allow him to chase his larger idea. At first, NACA kept the details of its slotted tunnels restricted, circulating a confidential report to the services and select manufacturers in the autumn of 1948. By the following spring, rumours ran through industry about what Langley could now do. Secrecy softened into public recognition when the 1951 Collier Trophy, as noted, honoured the slotted walls. NACA declared that its transonic tunnels had given the United States a 2-year lead in designing supersonic military aircraft. That claim contained a truth that mattered to Whitcomb. For the first time, engineers could watch the transonic in the tunnel with confidence. With the 8-foot tunnel now trustworthy, Whitcomb and his colleagues could blend the tunnel's strength with other ways of seeing. They used the tunnel balance to weigh the invisible forces, pressure taps to map how the air clung and separated, tufts of yarn to show where the flow was smooth or ragged, and, most strikingly, schlieren photography, which makes pressure waves show themselves as ghostly lines and edges. The images showed not one but 3 shock waves, wrapping around a model at transonic speeds. One crouched at the nose, the familiar bow shock of a body pushing hard into air. Another formed where the wing and fuselage met. The third sprang up near the wing's trailing edge. It was a revelation. Those additional shocks hinted that transonic drag did not belong chiefly to the nose, as designers had assumed, but to the overall distribution of body and wing. Whitcomb began to suspect that these shocks were not only symptoms, but causes of the drag rise that was robbing aircraft of performance. Now he turned to the basics of shape. High-speed designers had long followed a pattern inspired by Ernst Mach's observation that bullets created relatively little drag. Start with a pointed nose. Swell the fuselage to hold fuel people or weapons. Graft on wings and a tail, then taper smoothly away. The ideal streamlined body for supersonic flight was thought to be largely a matter of the fuselage's diameter and length. But wings and tails are not decorations, they are necessities. How to blend those necessities into Mach's ideal was the heart of Whitcomb's inquiry. In November 1951, the 8-foot tunnel team began a systematic set of tests, changing wings and bodies the way a tailor changes patterns and cloth. They tried swept wings, straight wings, delta wings. They tried fuselages with different curves and contours. They measured how much extra drag appeared when a wing was married to a fuselage and compared that to each piece alone. 2 lessons emerged for Whitcomb. First, subtle changes in the fuselage shape could make the wing's drag vary markedly, even before the wing itself was altered. Second, and more important, the old habit of thinking about the wing and the fuselage as separate sources of drag was misleading. They were a system. They had to be treated together. While these tests were underway, Whitcomb attended a technical symposium at Langley, where Adolf Busemann offered a helpful metaphor. Think of the airflow, Busemann said, as plumbing. Imagine the aeroplane enclosed by streamlines as if it sat inside a bundle of pipes of uniform flow. If you picture those pipes running over the surface, you can see where they are constricted, where they spread, and where they are forced into abrupt changes. For those who worked with wind tunnels, this way of visualizing could be as useful as a pencil or a slide rule. Whitcomb carried that mental image back to his office. He was in the habit, even since the Worcester days, of setting aside time each day to think. No calculations, no models, just imagination and memory. He had the rare gift of being able to see an aerodynamic process in his head, to watch the flow as if it were a clear stream over stones. The historian who later wrote about him described this as non-verbal thinking, the mind's eye doing the work of equations. For Whitcomb, this kind of intuition did not replace analysis. It guided it. It told him where to look. One afternoon in December 1951, with his feet propped on his desk and the tunnel's recent results simmering in his thoughts, he had the spark he needed. If transonic drag rose not simply because of the nose, but because of the distribution of cross-sectional areas along the length of the entire aeroplane, then perhaps the cure was to even out that distribution. He pictured those pipes of flow and saw where they were being squeezed after the wings bulk suddenly added to the fuselages. The answer, simple to imagine and difficult to accept at first, was to pinch the fuselage where the wings attach, narrow the body at the wing roots, and then allow it to swell again aft of the wing. The overall cross-sectional area along the length would be more uniform. The streamlines would be less prone to bunching and forming shock waves. The wasp-waisted fuselage would ease the air's passage from subsonic to supersonic, smoothing the climb through the transonic and preventing the energy-hungry shocks that were otherwise born just behind the wing. Historians Donald Bowles and William Corliss later called those sudden, drag-inducing effects aerodynamic anchors, and Whitcomb's insight amounted to lifting them. He set about verifying the idea, cross-checking what the 8-foot tunnel had shown with the body of NACA data and that plumbing picture of flow. The more he compared, the more sense it made. Yet even at Langley, even among colleagues who respected him, the notion prompted skepticism. He gave a short talk at one of Langley's internal seminars to lay it out. A concise 20 minutes, no fanfare. Among those listening was Adolf Busemann, who at the end offered a wry, appreciative remark. Some people come up with half-baked ideas and call them theories. Whitcomb comes up with a brilliant idea and calls it a rule of thumb. And so the name stuck, drawn from the marriage of cross-sectional area and rule of thumb. With Busemann's nod still echoing in the back of his mind, Whitcomb returned to the 8-foot high-speed tunnel with a clearer picture of what he wanted to prove. He set models in the airflow whose fuselages drew in at the midsection, as though the aeroplane were quietly holding its breath. Week by week the numbers mounted. By April 1952, there was enough evidence to say, calmly and with confidence, that narrowing the fuselage at the wing roots brought a marked drop in transonic drag. He captured the work in a tightly argued memorandum, a study of the zero lift drag characteristics of wing-body combinations near the speed of sound, which appeared that September. The document was shared discreetly with industry. The idea itself would travel farther and faster than any courier. The rule he had distilled offered designers a tidy path, a 4-step way to turn a vague wish for less drag into a fuselage you could actually draw. First, you mapped the cross-sectional area of the fuselage along its entire length, from nose to tail. Second, you set that real distribution against an ideal one suggested by previous NACA mathematics, while keeping an eye on practical constraints, the diameter of an engine, for instance, or the width you had to respect so the aeroplane would fit an aircraft carrier's lift. Third came reconciliation. Nudge and massage the shape so the actual distribution marched more nearly in step with the ideal, all without betraying the needs of structure, systems, and mission. Finally, you translated that adjusted area curve back into real cross-sections, which naturally produced a wasp-waisted body and gentle bulges aft to account for the wing's volume. Follow these steps faithfully, and you had a machine that could thread the Transonic without paying a ruinous toll. Now the rule would have to stand in daylight. In San Diego, Convair was finishing the design of a new all-weather supersonic interceptor begun in 1951 under a substantial Air Force contract. The YF-102 combined a bullet-like fuselage, the classic high-speed ideal, with a delta wing first proven on Convair's XF-92A research aeroplane, and it would be pushed by Pratt & Whitney's J-57, then the most powerful turbojet in the world at 10,000 pounds of thrust. It was to carry only missiles, fired ahead or in pursuit, a piloted spear for the nation's air defence. Word of the NACA's transonic findings had reached Convair, and with it a worry. If their sleek new interceptor could not slip cleanly past Mach 1 in level flight, the contract, the reputation, the work of years might be undone. A team of Convair engineers arrived at Langley in mid-August 1952, just in time to see their YF-102 model tested in the 8-foot tunnel. The result was not what they hoped. By the NACA's measures, transonic drag near Mach 1 was so large that the J-57 would be robbed of the power it needed to carry the aeroplane through the barrier. They asked Whitcomb, almost bluntly, what might be done. He explained his new rule of thumb, the logic, the data, but the picture was new. His own boss, John Stack, was thought to be cautious about it, and Convair's people, after a long journey home with their model, remained unconvinced. The rule had not yet earned their trust. That skepticism did not stop Whitcomb. He began working directly with Convair aerodynamicists, threading the area rule into the YF-102's lines. Fresh wind tunnel runs in May 1953 showed a modest but real decline in transonic drag. In August, he flew to San Diego, rolled up his sleeves, and helped reshape the fuselage. By October, the NACA judged that the modified design, soon to be called the YF-102A, would go supersonic. Convair, however, hedged. The original YF-102 continued into prototype production. Perhaps it would prove the calculations too gloomy. It did not. In full-scale trials with the Air Force in January 1954, the straight-bodied Delta fighter could only manage Mach 0.98 in level flight. That disappointing peak, almost but not quite across the line, confirmed what the tunnel had foretold and what Whitcomb's analysis had implied. After NACA Director Hugh Dryden assured the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Nathan F. Twining, that a sound solution existed and had been shared with Convair and the wider industry, the service made the hard call. Production of the YF-102 would stop. Convair was ordered to retool for the area-ruled version. Because Convair had been quietly collaborating with Whitcomb, the turnaround was swift. In 7 months, the prototype YF-102A was ready. It looked leaner, tidier. The nose and canopy were sharpened. Fairings swelled the tail to smooth the flow. The fuselage pinched gracefully at the wing. A hotter J-57, with afterburner, could now produce 17,000 pounds of thrust. But the essential difference was the Coke bottle waist, though Whitcomb preferred the more modest word indented, that let the streamlines take a calmer path. In this guise, the YF-102A stepped into supersonic flight with ease. On the 21st of December 1954, Convair test pilot Pete Everest lifted from Lindbergh Field and slipped easily past the sound barrier and kept right on going. In the same breath, the new machine proved it could do more than barely break the line. Its top speed had climbed by roughly a quarter, to about Mach 1.2. The Air Force renewed its confidence and its contract. Convair would ultimately deliver 975 production F-100 2A interceptors, the first arriving in active service by mid-1956. The leap in capability was felt across squadrons. The F-102A could cruise at about 1,000 miles per hour and reach well above 50,000 feet. It replaced 3 subsonic interceptors, the North American F-86D Sabre, the F-89 Scorpion, and the F-94 Starfire, whose ceilings were around 45,000 feet and whose speed sat in the 600–650 miles per hour band. Speed and height were only part of the story. The F-102A carried a proper anti-bomber armament. Hughes Falcon-guided missiles and swarms of Mighty Mouse rockets, tucked into an internal bay that reduced drag and kept the air clean along the fuselage. Against the Soviet Myasishchev Bison, Tupolev Bear and Ilyushin Badger, it offered reach and punch. The public noticed the turn of fortune. Early reports had suggested the F-102 might be consigned to the scrap heap, unable to wriggle through the barrier. Now the area-ruled F-102A had also swept past the sonic problem. There were trade-offs. The J-57 was loud, and Air Force bases reached out to local civic leaders, offering familiarization flights to explain the mission and context for the noise. Yet the broader direction was set. Convair followed with the F-106 Delta Dart, produced from 1956 to 1960, its Pratt & Whitney J-75 giving it twice the speed of the Dagger. The F-106 became the continental United States' principal air defense interceptor into the early 1980s. Convair, for its part, turned the lesson into a habit. The Sea Dart and the B-58 Hustler embraced area-ruled shaping as well. If you enjoy this gentle walk through the history of flight, you're welcome, quietly, when you're ready, to subscribe to and like Space Historian. so these nighttime stories can keep drifting to you without breaking the calm. The YF-100-2 YF-100 2A episode did more than rescue a single program. It demonstrated to industry and the services that the area rule and the NACA itself mattered. Once the pattern was clear, others followed. Chance Vought reworked its carrier-borne F-8U Crusader around an area-ruled fuselage. The first production aircraft appeared in September 1956. Deliveries began in March 1957, and in July that year, Marine Major John H. Glenn Jr., as part of Project Bullet, raced from Los Angeles to New York in 3 hours 23 minutes, an exclamation point written in contrails. Crusaders served through the 1960s and 1970s in Navy and Marine fighter and reconnaissance squadrons, the last leaving frontline duties in 1987. Grumman went a step further, becoming the first to design an area-ruled aeroplane from clean sheet to carrier deck. Under contract to build the Navy's Supersonic F9F9 Tiger, Grumman sent engineers to Langley 2 weeks after Whitcomb's pivotal September 1952 report, hungry to learn. Whitcomb visited Bethpage in February 1953 to examine the design before NACA ran wind tunnel and rocket model tests. The verdict was heartening. The Tiger would go supersonic in level flight with no serious transonic drag penalty. In August 1954, test pilot C.H. Corky Meyer nudged the prototype through Mach 1 in level flight without lighting the afterburner, 4 months before the F-102A's publicized supersonic run. Later, redesignated the F-11F1, the Tiger flew with the fleet as a frontline fighter from 1957 to 1961 and with the Blue Angels, drawing silver lines across summer skies. A different lineage emerged out west at Lockheed's Skunk Works. In 1954, the team unveiled the F-104 Starfighter, the missile with a man in it. With its slim fuselage, tiny trapezoidal wings, and a sharp nose, the production prototype, powered by General Electric's J-79, became the first jet to exceed Mach 2 on the 24th of April 1956. Starfighters reached Air Force units in 1958, and an international production arrangement spread the type to 14 nations across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. In many places, it stood watch at the edge of the Cold War for decades thereafter. With the area rule now a standard part of the designer's toolkit, attention could shift to other corners of the aeroplane, refining the whole system. Whitcomb continued to issue papers, sometimes alone and sometimes with colleague Thomas L. Fischetti, making the principle more useful and more precise. He kept a special eye on the F-8U-1 Crusader, shepherding improvements that would help make it one of the outstanding fighters of the post-war era. The engineers at NACA's Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory in Cleveland peered further down the road. They estimated that improvements in jet engines, new alloys to hold their strength at heat, and clever inlet designs with variable geometry for both intake and exhaust could push speeds toward 2,600 miles per hour, roughly Mach 4. However one forecast the future, one thing seemed settled. The supersonic aeroplanes of the 1950s and 1960s would wear area-ruled fuselages. In those tense years, when the Cold War pressed and the balance of technology felt elastic yet consequential, the area rule gave the United States defense establishment breathing space. For a time, it was a guarded secret. Trade journals had hints as early as January 1954, but they kept the confidence for national security. The plan was to tell the story publicly when the first production aeroplane with the new shaping reached the line. In September 1955, Aero Digest broke cover a week early with a ringing headline, "The sound barrier has been broken for good," and called the area rule the first major aerodynamic breakthrough of the past decade. its editors emphasized the key practical truth: the same performance with less power, or more performance for the same. An official announcement followed. On the 11th of September 1955, Secretary of the Air Force Donald A. Quarles told viewers of CBS's Face the Nation that the area rule was exactly the sort of breakthrough that proves the worth of basic research. Aviation Week called it one of the most significant military scientific advances since the atomic bomb. Phrases like these may sound grand, but they captured a genuine shift. The NACA's patient work had moved the line of what was possible. The public, in search of metaphors, reached for the familiar. People called the new contour a Coke bottle, a wasp-waist, an hourglass, even a Marilyn Monroe figure. The NACA gently protested that Dietrich Kuckermann's Coke bottle concept from 1944 was not the same as Whitcomb's rule. Kuckermann's work pertained specifically to swept wings and the local shaping of streamlines. Whitcomb's principle applied to any overall configuration and concerned the total stream tube, the way the cross-sectional area of body, wings and tail added up along the length. Whitcomb himself always understated, liked the word indented. A writer in the Christian Science Monitor offered another image. Think of Huckleberry Finn sucking in his stomach to slip through Aunt Polly's fence. Recognition came swiftly. For the 3 years of work that produced the area rule, the National Aeronautic Association awarded Whitcomb the Collier Trophy for 1954, praising a powerful, simple, and useful method to cut transonic drag and the power required to overcome it. The citation declared the area rule a contribution to fundamental knowledge that increased speed and range while reducing resistance with no greater power, a concise statement of elegance. Vice President Richard M. Nixon presented the trophy, and in that moment, Whitcomb's name joined a roll that included Orville Wright, Glenn Curtiss, and his own mentor, John Stack. Honours followed. He received the U.S. Air Force Exceptional Service Medal in 1955 and the NACA's first Distinguished Service Medal in 1956. That same year, his alma mater, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, awarded him an honorary doctorate in engineering. In 1958, he became head of Langley's Transonic Aerodynamics branch. It was a season of ferment at NACA and at Langley in particular, X-planes with the services, Robert T. Jones's elegant swept wing theory, investigations into variable sweep wings, and the steady refinement of high-speed configurations, two of whose pillars, the slotted tunnel and the area rule, bore Whitcomb's hand. Yet he was not one to rest. After area ruling, he pressed further into the borderlands between transonic and supersonic flight. In the late 1950s, with subsonic jetliners becoming commercially practical, many in aeronautics set their sights on what seemed the next rung of the ladder, a supersonic transport. John Stack, now within NASA, understood the civil promise and the prestige and prioritized SST research in 1958, even as the agency's attention bent skyward to space. Through the Supersonic Transport Research Committee, he and his successor Lawrence K. Loftin Jr. shepherded concepts for a supersonic commercial air transport, SCAT, seeking an airliner that would outperform even the Mach 3 XB-70 Valkyrie in cruise. Whitcomb contributed a striking configuration, SCAT-4, with 6 engines, an arrow-shaped, highly swept wing, and on paper, the best lift-to-drag ratio among Langley's proposals. The manufacturer's deeper analyses were less encouraging. SEAT-4, they said, had the lowest range and the highest weight among the set, would cost more to operate and to fuel, and compared poorly with subsonic transports on economics. President John F. Kennedy announced in June 1963 a national aim to build a commercially successful supersonic transport superior to that being built in any other country in the world. But Whitcomb read the signs. In 1963, he gently stepped away from the American SST effort. "I'm going back where I know I can make things pay off," he said, choosing the practical over the glamorous, the promise of true efficiency over the chase for raw speed. He turned his attention to the part of an aeroplane that does the most work and causes the most mischief: the wing. Airfoils had evolved across the century. Wright brothers' thin, cambered sections, the thick German profiles of the First World War, the Clark Y of the 1920s that became an industry standard, the NACA 4- and 5-digit families created by Eastman Jacobs, each reflecting a fresh grasp of how air and shape meet. For all that progress, subsonic aircraft were only about 85% efficient by the measures of the day. As speeds crept toward roughly 660 miles per hour, uncomfortable things happened. Drag climbed, stability faltered. On the top of a conventional wing, local air could tip into supersonic velocities, while the rest of the aeroplane was still solidly subsonic, and the wing would begin to buffet. Pilots and passengers paid the price with reduced performance and a rougher ride. When Whitcomb returned to the problem in 1964, he carried a specific ambition: to create a wing for commercial transports that would delay the onset of the transonic drag rise, smoothing the airflow over the largest aerodynamic surface on the aeroplane. He did something characteristically bold. He imagined overturning convention. Where traditional sections bulged on top and fell away front and back to summon lift, he pictured an upper surface that stayed comparatively flat, with the downward curve placed aft. On this supercritical shape, shockwaves would form later and farther back, and their strength would be gentler, raising the wing's overall efficiency. To make up for lift lost by flattening the top, he deepened the lower rear surface into a more pronounced concavity. He blunted the leading edge too, which quietly aided takeoff, landing, and low-speed handling. In sum, the new section slowed the airflow where it needed slowing, softened the shocks, cut drag and buffet, and improved stability. With the new wing shape held clearly in his mind's eye, Whitcomb did what he always did. He turned the picture into numbers, and the numbers into something he could hold in his hands. He worked the mathematics until a family of curves began to make sense, then carved those curves into a wind tunnel model himself. He camped beside the 8-foot transonic pressure tunnel like a watchman at a lighthouse, grabbing sleep on a nearby cot when the machines allowed it. The tunnel ran in shifts, day and night, and he rode those shifts like tides. "When I've got an idea," he liked to say, "I'm up in the tunnel. The 8-foot runs on 2 shifts, so you have to stay with the job 16 hours a day. I didn't want to drive back and forth just to sleep, so I ended up bringing a cot out here." It sounded matter-of-fact, but it was also a glimpse of the boy in the basement workshop, now grown and endlessly patient with moving air. If you find this kind of unhurried journey through aerospace history soothing, you're welcome to gently subscribe to and like Space Historian. It keeps these nighttime stories gliding to you without breaking the calm. In time, Whitcomb and researcher Larry L. Clark gathered the early results and set them down in a report with an unassuming title: An Airfoil Shape for Efficient Flight at Supercritical Mach Numbers. They compared a supercritical aerofoil with a standard NASA section and found that the supercritical profile changed the way drag rose as speeds edged towards the high subsonic. When Whitcomb presented his initial findings at a Langley conference in May 1966, he also gave the new idea its name. Supercritical borrowed the super from beyond and joined it to the critical Mach number, the point where patches of supersonic flow first flash into being over a wing. Where a conventional wing in those conditions grows a strong shockwave, piles up drag, and sheds its boundary layer, the supercritical profile softened the shock and reduced separation. In tests with a wing swept to 35 degrees, Whitcomb measured about 5% less drag steadier behaviour, and less buffeting than a conventional wing at speeds up to Mach 0.90. Lawrence K. Loftin, Langley's director of aeronautics, believed the new shape would cut transonic drag enough to make a real dent in fuel burn, but he also knew the limits of reports and wind tunnel photographs. Manufacturers would need to see an aeroplane fly with such a wing before they trusted it. Loftin first invited independent mathematicians at the Courant Institute of New York University to put the theory on firmer ground. Their analysis confirmed that Whitcomb's idea was sound. Then came the harder part, a flight research program which would ask the wing to prove itself in the sky. The right people met in March 1967 to plan that program. Manufacturing realities, flight characteristics, structure, and safety all had to be weighed. The group chose the Navy's Chancevort F-8, a fighter, as the flying testbed. It was not an airliner, but it was ideal in other ways. Its wing could be removed and replaced in modular fashion. Its landing gear was in the fuselage, so it would not intrude on wing experiments. Its engine had enough thrust to live in the transonic world, and it was cheaper to operate than a multi-engine transport. Langley hired Vought to design a supercritical wing for the F-8 and kept Whitcomb involved through the summer 1967 tunnel tests. Then in January 1968, NASA headquarters suspended all ongoing contracts, and Vought stepped back. The idea would need another path. That path arrived in a joint effort between Langley and the Flight Research Center, formalized in November 1968. Loftin and Whitcomb led the Langley side. They set the overarching aims, defined the contours and the construction tolerances, and ran wind tunnel tests to support the flying work. The Flight Research Center determined the wing's size, weight, and balance, acquired the F-8A airframe, oversaw modifications, and led the test flying. North American Rockwell won the contract to build the supercritical wing and delivered it in November 1970 for about $1.8 million. Technicians fitted the new wing to a Navy surplus TF-8A trainer, turning an ordinary machine into a quiet revolution with a tailhook. Before the flying began, Whitcomb offered a simple prediction. With such a wing, future airliners could cruise 100 miles per hour faster, close to the speed of sound, roughly 660 miles an hour, at 45,000 feet, without asking for more power than they already had. NASA test pilot Thomas C. McMurtry took the F-8 supercritical wing research aeroplane into the air on the 9th of March 1971. Over the next 2 years, he would make 86 flights, the program winding down on the 23rd of May 1973. A progress report, Supercritical Wing Technology, gathered the findings as they came. McMurtry's own note, quietly reassuring, said that a supercritical wing should not complicate everyday airline operations. The combined flight and tunnel results told a larger story, a potential efficiency gain of 15% for commercial aeroplanes, and an improvement in profits under real operating assumptions of about 2.5%. In an industry where margins are thin and the distance is long, the promise to increase range, speed, and fuel efficiency without demanding more engine power or more weight was more than appealing. It was disruptive in a welcoming way. The F-8 work proved the concept. NASA then looked outward. In 1972, the Transonic Aircraft Technology TACT program began as a joint NASA-US Air Force venture. Where the F-8 had been a pure research platform, TACT explored how the supercritical idea might live inside an operational combat aeroplane. The team chose a modified General Dynamics F-111A with its variable sweep wings and studied everything from handling qualities and transonic maneuverability to the local aerodynamics and wake drag of the new profile. Whitcomb worked side by side with General Dynamics and the Air Force Flight Dynamics Laboratory. In parallel, Langley and the Flight Research Center kept up the comparison between the tunnel and the sky, refining the shapes and deepening the theory. Whitcomb's method, from the outside, could look old-fashioned in an age that prized pure computation. He advanced by logic and cut and try, what John Becker, with a friendly smile, called Edisonian, not because it was crude, but because it asked invention to walk hand in hand with intuition. Over the 8 years he pursued the wing, his unusual feel for the air's habits led him to a shape the equations later blessed. Mathematicians verified what he had found and wrote the formulae that industry could adopt. In May 1976, he received patent number 3,952,971 for the supercritical wing. NASA held the licensing rights and requests were already flowing in from abroad. Even with promise, adoption was slow in the late 1970s. Government experts and airlines agreed the savings were real, perhaps $300 million a year across the industry. But new aeroplanes are expensive, and retrofitting old ones costs more than money. It costs time and disruption. Analyses suggested as much as $1.5 billion in fuel might be spent before a full transition paid for itself. What moved minds was not a memo, but a crisis. During the Arab oil embargo, the price of a gallon of fuel leapt from 12 to 30 cents within a year, and efficiency went from a virtue to a necessity. The first production aeroplanes to wear supercritical wings came from the military side, during the US Air Force's competition for an advanced medium-short takeoff and landing transport to replace the Lockheed C-130 Hercules. McDonnell Douglas's YC-15, which flew in 1975, carried the new wing. Boeing's YC-14, though it would not replace the Hercules either after the competition was cancelled, used a supercritical aerofoil as well. At the time, the press called the wings an exotic advance, a phrase that felt apt in an era of oil shocks and rising costs. Boeing's choice grew from several streams. The company had researched the 747's wing and learned much. It had Whitcomb's Langley results to draw upon, and it had watched a Navy T-2C Buckeye, modified by North American Aviation with a supercritical section, fly trials beginning in November 1969 as a stepping stone for the F-8 work. The close match between tunnel data and flight performance persuaded Boeing to carry the supercritical approach not only onto the YC-14 but into its future airliners, culminating years later in the paperless 777, designed with an unprecedented level of digital integration, but still bearing the shapes Whitcomb had imagined. Business aviation, always sensitive to fuel and range, embraced the idea as the 1970s wore on. Bill Lear took the technology into the Canadair Challenger 600, which first flew in 1978. Rockwell International applied it to the upgraded Sabreliner 65 in 1979. Dassault's Falcon 50, extensively redesigned and introduced that same year, wore supercritical wings that helped it reach beyond 3,000 miles. The program gave NASA more than graphs and numbers. It gave the agency visibility in a decade when space pulled attention from aeronautics. Historian Richard P. Hallion called the supercritical wing program Dryden's lifeblood in the early 1970s, and it is easy to see why. It offered a clear practical advance that pilots could feel and airlines could count. Today, subsonic transports, business jets, STOL designs, and even uncrewed aerial vehicles use supercritical technology. All modern airliners fly on supercritical aerofoils, each tailored and tuned by the manufacturer with computational fluid dynamics. There is no single NASA supercritical family in the way there were NACA 4 and 5-digit series. The principle is universal, the implementation bespoke. yet you can trace a line from Whitcomb's sketches to the Boeing 777's wing. Much of that revolution arrived quietly in NASA technical notes and through direct conversations at Langley. A Lockheed engineer who worked for Whitcomb in the late 1960s remembered that hardly a week passed without someone from industry coming by his office for advice. NASA was constantly being asked for technical advice, he recalled, and Dick always gave that advice freely. He was always there when industry wanted him to help out. That spirit of sharing helped carry supercritical thinking into every corner of aviation. Recognition followed Whitcomb as the idea took flight. In 1969, NASA awarded him the Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement. 5 years later, Administrator James Fletcher presented him with a $25,000 cash award for the invention, a sum that at the time was the largest given to a single individual by the agency. The American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics had already honored him with the Sylvanus Albert Reed Award in 1969. In 1973, President Richard M. Nixon placed around his neck the National Medal of Science, the highest scientific honor the United States bestows. And in 1974, the National Aeronautic Association awarded him the Wright Brothers Memorial Trophy for his twin achievements, the Area Rule and the Supercritical Wing. Even as those medals found their way into drawers and frames, Whitcomb's attention drifted, as always, to the next puzzle. The OPEC oil embargo of 1973-1974 forced air travel to reckon with energy costs. In response, NASA launched the Aircraft Energy Efficiency Program, a national push to save fuel where the physics allowed. Around this time, an article in Science magazine explored how soaring birds used their tip feathers to manage lift and drag. Whitcomb's mind jumped to the wingtips of aeroplanes, to the three-dimensional flows there, and to the kind of drag most sensitive to how wings lift the air: induced drag. Two types of drag matter to a wing's efficiency. Profile drag is mostly two-dimensional. You can picture it in a simple textbook diagram of streamlines over a cross-section. Induced drag is inherently three-dimensional and lives at the tips. Air at higher pressure under the wing wants to curl upward and spill around the tip into the lower pressure region above. That curling flow rolls into a vortex that trails behind, like a slow screw turned in the sky. The energy tied up in that swirling wake is energy you cannot use to move forward. In high-lift, low-speed regimes, induced drag can be large. For subsonic transports, it can account for as much as half the total drag. Whitcomb wanted to tame those tip vortices. He imagined a new structure at the wingtip, a vertical surface shaped not as a simple fence, but as a small wing, what he would call a winglet. By carefully choosing the cant, the angle the winglet leans from the vertical, and the toe, the angle it presents to the local flow, the designer can make the winglet produce a side force. Place that force forward of the wing's aerofoils, and it can draw useful thrust out of the turbulent tip flow. George Larson, an aviation writer, offered an image, like a sailboat tacking into the wind while the keel, pressed by the water, squeezes the boat forward like a pinched watermelon seed. The basic idea of non-planar lifting systems was not wholly new. In the late 19th century, as pioneers were first thinking about heavier-than-air flight, it was already clear that tip vortices were wasteful. In 1897, Frederick W. Lanchester patented vertical end plates for the tips of wings and showed they could cut drag at high lift. In the United States, the Army Air Service Engineering Division studied such ideas in 1924, and the NACA followed in 1938. Britain's Aeronautical Research Committee took them up again in 1956. On paper, these vertical surfaces promised better aerodynamics. In practice, simple end plates typically added too much profile drag to make the trade worthwhile. The trick would be to get the benefits without paying that penalty. From 1974 to 1976, Whitcomb and his team returned to the 8-foot Transonic pressure tunnel to look for that trick. They tested a semi-span model of a first-generation, narrow-body subsonic transport, a model cut in half and mounted to the tunnel wall, which allowed a larger, half-aeroplane, higher Reynolds numbers, and better instrumentation. They compared two approaches to the same structural load at the tip, a straight extension that simply increased the span, and a properly designed winglet. The result was striking. Winglets cut drag by roughly 20% and, compared with the straight extension, doubled the improvement in lift-to-drag ratio to about 9%. Whitcomb wrote up the findings in A Design Approach and Selected Wind Tunnel Results at High Subsonic Speeds for Wingtip-Mounted Winglets, then set out the general rules so others could follow. What distinguished a winglet from a mere vertical add-on was the way it used familiar wing design principles to produce the right-side forces. The winglet diffused the tip vortex, reducing the inflow above the tip and the outflow below it, like fitting a gentle nozzle to a noisy hose. Placement and height had to balance aerodynamic efficiency against structural weight. A lower winglet could not hang far beneath the tip, or it would be prone to damage on the ground. Fortunately, the best aerofoil shape for the winglet itself turned out to be a NASA profile already known from general aviation, easing the path to practical designs. Whitcomb's rules gave designers a map. The experiments continued in the 8-foot tunnel as the 1970s progressed. With colleagues Stuart G. Fleckner and Peter F. Jacobs, Whitcomb turned to a semi-span model that suggested a second-generation jet transport, something like a Douglas DC-10, and ran it at Mach numbers from 0.70 to 0.83. Again, the numbers came back encouraging. Winglets lowered the induced drag coefficient and trimmed overall drag, smoothing the swirling wake behind the tips and adding a touch of lift into the bargain. As before, the winglets outperformed simple extensions, even though they added a small increment to the wing's bending moments. One more benefit stood out. Winglets made it possible to increase a wing's aspect ratio, the span-to-chord proportion that governs so much of its efficiency, without making the wing itself longer and more flexible. Long, thin wings are efficient at a given cruise speed because they suffer less from tip vortices, but they also bend more under load and need strengthening, which means weight. Winglets offered a way around that trade. For every foot of wingspan you add, you increase bending. A wing built strong enough to accept another 2 feet of span, engineers found, could also carry 3-foot winglets while producing the same gain in aspect ratio. NASA made sure that the American aviation world did not miss what Whitcomb had uncovered about winglets and how it folded into the Aircraft Energy Efficiency Program. To that end, Langley hosted a gathering from the 28th of February to the 3rd of March 1978, spotlighting advanced technologies for conventional takeoff and landing aeroplanes, airliners, business jets, and personal aircraft alike. In the session devoted to advanced aerodynamic controls, Stuart Fleckner and Peter Jacobs laid out the wind tunnel results for winglets fitted to models of a Boeing KC-135 aerial tanker, the Lockheed L-1011, the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, and a generic high aspect ratio wing. Representatives from McDonnell Douglas and Boeing followed with presentations of their own work under NASA contracts. The mood was keen. Interest in winglets ran wide in the room and spread afterwards as manufacturers across the country began weighing them for current fleets and future designs. For a moment, the first practical adopters were not the airlines at all, but visionaries in general aviation. While Whitcomb and his colleagues were refining winglets on transport models at Langley, another restless engineer, Bert Rutan, began mounting them on his own innovative designs. His home-built Variés of 1974 wore winglets that also served as vertical control surfaces, with its forward, canard, high-aspect wings, light composite structure, modest engine, and pusher propeller. The Variés offered private pilots an aeroplane out of a different future. Rutan's non-stop, round-the-world Voyager and, later, the Beechcraft Starship of 1986 carried winglets too, underscoring the idea's versatility beyond the airline ramp. If you're drifting along with this quiet thread of invention and want more like it, you're warmly invited, whenever it suits you, to subscribe to and like Space Historian. It helps keep these calm night flights coming without disturbing the story. Business jets became the first production machines to embrace winglets at scale. Learjet led with the Model 28 in 1977, a jet built as a flying testbed, while the company developed its larger Model 55. Lear called the high-aspect wing and winglet system Longhorn and developed it independently. No matter, the lineage of the winglet was clear. Back-to-back flights of the Model 28 with and without winglets showed a range increase of roughly 6.5%, along with steadier directional behaviour. Learjet displayed the 28 at the National Business Aircraft Association meeting and put it into production on the strength of those gains, then carried winglets into its later models. Gulfstream ran its own evaluations. The Gulfstream 3, 4 and V would all incorporate winglets. The GV, introduced in 1995, could cruise at about Mach 0.80 for 6,500 nautical miles, amassing more than 70 national and world records and earning the 1997 Collier Trophy. More telling than trophies, executives could now fly New York to Tokyo without a fuel stop. Airline acceptance was mixed at first. Under the ACE umbrella, Boeing, Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas all studied whether winglets made sense for their existing types. Because winglets are a fundamental aerodynamic device, each design has to be tailored to its airframe. NASA let contracts to help manufacturers test ideas on both current and future aircraft. In May 1977, Boeing judged that the economics for the 747 did not justify the cost of fabricating winglets. Lockheed chose to extend the L-1011's wingtips and to add flight control tweaks to mitigate added loads. McDonnell Douglas, by contrast, embraced winglets as an alternative to simply increasing wingspan and modified a DC-10 for trials. The next step fell naturally to NASA and Whitcomb. Flight tests on representative first and second generation transports. The Air Force's Boeing KC-135 aerial tanker became the first test airframe. Like its 707 civilian sibling and other early jets, it had an outer wing with elliptical span loading and heavy loads near the tips, conditions ideal for winglets. The Air Force, keen to stretch the tanker's performance and fuel economy, partnered readily. Whitcomb's team drew the winglet design. Boeing handled structural design and fabrication. NASA and the Air Force ran the flight tests at Dryden in 1979 and 1980. The results aligned with Langley's tunnel runs. Induced drag dropped by about 20%, and cruise lift to drag improved by roughly 7%. McDonnell Douglas followed in 1981 with a DC-10 evaluation under NASA's Energy Efficient Transport Program, itself part of ACE. The DC-10 represented a second-generation airliner designed to avoid tip pitch-up through non-elliptic loading. Its bending moments were therefore less acute than those of a first-generation 707 family wing. Whitcomb's team performed preliminary tunnel work with a DC-10 model in the 8-foot TPT. McDonnell Douglas engineers designed and built the flight hardware and spent 16 months flying, including 61 back-to-back comparison flights with a DC-10 leased from Continental Airlines. The verdict? Winglets, coupled with a droop of the outboard ailerons, cut fuel burn by about 3% at typical passenger ranges. Exactly the sort of bottom-line improvement airline accountants notice. The DC-10 itself did not receive winglets, largely because the Federal Aviation Administration recertification costs were prohibitive. But McDonnell Douglas had become a convert. It rolled the experience, test data, and design rules forward into the MD-11, launched in 1986. The prototype flew in January 1990 and endured a 10-month certification campaign that validated winglets for that airframe. The extended-range MD-11 could carry nearly 300 passengers more than 8,200 miles, well suited to the long Pacific legs opening up in that era. Boeing, initially reluctant, elected in 1985 to incorporate winglets into the new 747-400, making it the first large US transport to do so. The addition brought about a 3% range increase, convertible to either extra distance or extra payload. Boeing's winglet differed from McDonnell Douglas's. It omitted a small lower fin. With the 747's low-mounted wing and the realities of ground equipment around the aeroplane, the company judged the lower surface impractical. Boeing's interest broadened from there. Winglets were offered as an option on the 737 family, and in the early 1990s, a Seattle firm, Aviation Partners, introduced a proprietary blended winglet, joining wing and winglet with a smooth, characteristic curve. The company began by retrofitting Gulfstream II business jets. The result was an efficiency gain of roughly 7%. Success drew the airlines. Aviation Partners' 737 installations delivered fuel savings and lower noise footprints. A joint venture, Aviation Partners Boeing, followed, producing winglets for 757S and 767S. By 2003, more than 2,500 Boeing airliners flew with blended winglets. By 2006, a pair of 8-foot-tall winglets cost on the order of $600,000. Across the Atlantic, Airbus fitted winglets to production A319XA, A320SS, A330S, and A340S. Regardless of badge, the logic was the same. A pair of winglets could save roughly 5% in fuel. Most operators chose to pocket that savings by continuing to cruise at pre-winglet speeds rather than using the extra efficiency to fly faster. Winglets even slipped off the runway and into water. As Australia prepared for the 1983 America's Cup, entrepreneur Alan Bond reasoned that Whitcomb's work on spiral vortex drag could apply to yachts. His team developed a winged keel, a small winglet at the base of the keel, for Australia 2. When Australia II broke a 130-year American winning streak, the sailing world credited the innovation as a decisive edge. Bond later argued that the Cup victory prodded the airline industry into adopting winglets, and believed McDonnell Douglas began experimenting only in summer 1984. Claims that confused the timeline but captured the moment's excitement. Of Whitcomb's three triumphs, the area-ruled fuselage, the supercritical wing, and the winglet, it is the last that most passengers would recognize in an instant from a window seat. As engineer historian Joseph R. Chambers remarked, no other single NASA concept has seen such wide, international adoption as Whitcomb's winglets. Their use across commercial, military, and general aviation continues to grow. Through all this, industry kept trying to recruit the man himself. Whitcomb preferred Langley and the independence it afforded. What you have here is what most researchers like: independence, he said at the height of the supercritical wing era. In private industry, there is very little chance to think ahead. You have to worry about getting that contract in 5 or 6 months. His autonomy owed much to his relationship with Lawrence K. Loftin, Chief of Aerodynamic Research, which shielded Whitcomb's way of working into the late 1970s. When orders came down to test a laminar flow concept in the 8-foot TPT, a tunnel so closely associated with Whitcomb that colleagues half-jokingly called it his, he judged the project impractical. In February 1980, he retired as head of the Transonic Aerodynamics branch. He had arrived as a young engineer in 1943. 37 years later, he stepped aside. Part of the decision came from a sense that his independence was under threat. Part of it was simpler. He believed he had finished the work that was his to do. He had always tuned himself to the national challenges of the moment and set out to meet them. "We've done all the easy things. Let's do the hard ones," he liked to say, emphasizing the word hard. In the early years, the Cold War and the need for credible air defense made the area rule urgent. In the 1960s and 1970s, fuel shocks and a shifting economic climate made the supercritical wing and winglets essential. He was, by nature, a work ethic bachelor, focused almost entirely on subsonic aerodynamics. Reserved outside the lab, he was unrestrained within it, chasing solutions with a highly intuitive, individual method. After the big chapters, Whitcomb stayed on as a part-time, unpaid distinguished research associate until 1991. He had written more than 30 technical papers, given countless formal talks, and taught in Langley's graduate program. He remained a valued voice in the centre's many symposia. Away from work, he supported the arts in Hampton and began a personal search for alternative energy sources to displace fossil fuels. His legacy lives in the fleets of today. Airliners, transports, business jets, and military aeroplanes take practical advantage of the area rule, supercritical wings, and winglets. At the sharp end sits the US Air Force's Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor, a multi-role air superiority fighter for the 21st century. Capable of Mach 2, designed for sustained supersonic cruise, supercruise, the Raptor uses an area-ruled fuselage and a supercritical wing. It grew out of the Advanced Tactical Fighter program of 1986 and 1991, drawing deeply on NASA advances in fly-by-wire control, composite structures, and stealth. The Raptor first flew in 1997. Production examples began reaching squadrons in 2005. Whitcomb's own ideal transonic transport would also have worn an area-ruled fuselage, but most transports live firmly subsonic and do not need that shaping today. A clearer exemplar is the Air Force's C-17 Globemaster III. In the early 1990s, McDonnell Douglas drew on lessons from the YC-15 to combine supercritical aerofoils, winglets, advanced structures and materials, and 4 high-bypass turbofans. The result earned the 1994 Collier Trophy. Operational from 1995, the C-17 became a cornerstone of global logistics, a heavy-lift, air-refuelable cargo aircraft with uncommon range and versatility. After the C-17, McDonnell Douglas, merged into Boeing in 1997, pursued advanced blended wing body configurations paired with refined supercritical aerofoils and winglets with rudder surfaces through the 1990s. Meanwhile, Whitcomb's tools, the very tunnels that had enabled his insights, began to face their own twilight. The 8-foot high-speed tunnel and the 8-foot transonic pressure tunnel sit side by side on Langley's east side, between Langley Air Force Base and the Back River. In October 1985, the National Register of Historic Places named the Collier-winning 8-foot HST a National Historic Landmark. Yet soon after Whitcomb's area rule discovery, the NACA had suspended active operations there in 1956. By 2006, the Landmarks program listed it as threatened, with an uncertain future. The 8-foot TPT, opened in 1953, was the workhorse of Whitcomb's area rule validation and his supercritical wing and winglet research through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. It ceased operations in 1996 and is classed by NASA as abandoned. In the new century, space needs began to outweigh historical sentiment. Demolition loomed. Through it all, Whitcomb and Langley shared a single thread: a quest for aerodynamic efficiency. Langley gave Whitcomb the room and the instrument. Whitcomb filled that room with vision and patience. One observer called him flight theory personified. More broadly, he stands as a human emblem for the importance of the NACA and NASA to American aeronautics during the Second Aeronautical Revolution. The agencies hired remarkable people as a matter of principle to serve flight. Those minds together created innovations greater than the sum of their makers. Whitcomb, as one of those parts, fostered innovations that proved to be of long-standing value to aviation.